Good morning, everyone. I'm now going to call the meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations to order. Would anyone like to offer a prayer or reflection this morning, or do we consider ourselves sufficiently covered by AOC's prayer? Seeing no interest, we'll skip that item. Review and adoption of the agenda. Can I get a motion to approve it, please? Moved by Ms. Reid. Thank you. Declarations of conflict of interest. Anyone? Seeing none, thank you. Public matters today before committee. We've got the clause-by-clause review of Bill 12, the Business Day Statute Law Amendment Act, and a presentation from Kevin O'Reilly with Alternatives North on the NWT Heritage Fund Act statutory review. So with no further ado, we'll get into the clause-by-clause. So my name is Julian Morse. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake. I'm chair of this committee. Today's meeting is public and being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone to direct all comments and questions to me as chair. A technician will be turning on the mics on and off, so please wait to be recognized before speaking. This helps keep the meeting organized and running smoothly. And I'll ask committee members to introduce themselves. I'll start with Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome everyone. My name is Denny Rogers. I'm the MLA for Newbig-Boot Lake.
Good morning. Thank you for coming and joining us this morning. My name is Kate Reid. I'm the MLA for Great Slave.
Good morning, MLA. My name is Jane Way-Allen Armstrong, MLA for Mofi, Clayton Region. And I see somebody over there.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Hawkins. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife Center, and I'm always happy to be here and appreciate we probably have millions of subscribers watching this, as usual, on the Legislative Assembly website, so always appreciate it.
I'm Kieran Tester, member for Ranch Lake.
Good morning, Richard DeJerick. I'm MLA for Trinity Willity. Merci.
Operating mics from the booth. Okay, thank you. So this morning, the Standing Committee on Government Operations is reviewing Bill 12, the Business Day Statute Law Amendment Act. This bill is available on the Legislative Assembly website if anyone is interested. I would now invite the Honourable R.J. Simpson, Minister of Justice, to deliver any opening remarks. Following the Minister's remarks and any public comment, we'll proceed to clause-by-clause review of the bill. Minister Simpson, please introduce your staff and proceed with any opening remarks you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for inviting me to be here today to speak about Bill 12, Business Day Statute Law Amendment Act, and welcome to those folks watching from around the world. Today I'm joined by Brad Patzer, the ADM Attorney General with the Department of Justice, Victoria Carmichael, Legislative Counsel with the Department of Justice, and Frederic Bergeron, my Ministerial Special Advisor. Bill 12 will address an error that was made in 2017 when amendments to the Interpretation Act resulted in some government offices technically being required to be open on Sundays. This was not the intent of the changes from 2017. Bill 12 will amend 4 pieces of legislation to deal with this problem and to ensure Sundays are not interpreted as business days. Subsection 150(5) of the Business Corporation Act, Section 59 of the Consumer Protection Act, Section 62 of the Judicature Act, and Section 24 sub 2 of the Mechanics Lien Act. This concludes my opening remarks. Be pleased to answer any questions from committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Committee, do you have any questions for the Minister? Are there any questions from the public from the floor for the Minister? I would say it again, but it's quite clear that there are not. Oh, it's on the script. Does committee agree to proceed with a clause-by-clause review of Bill 12, the Business Day Statute Law Amendment Act?
Agree.
Thank you. We will defer the title of the bill until the end and begin with consideration of the clauses. So, Clause 1, shall Clause 1 carry? Agreed? Thank you. Clause 2, shall Clause 2 carry?
Yes.
Agreed. Thank you. Clause 3? Thank you. Clause 4. Thank you. We will now return to the bill number and title, Bill 12, Business Day Statute Law Amendment Act. Shall the bill's title and number carry? Agreed? Thank you. Does committee agree that Bill 12, the Business Day Statute Law Amendment Act, is now ready for consideration in committee of the whole? Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After that robust work and review we've done, I think I'm prepared to move a motion. I'll say I move that Bill 12, the Business Day Statute Law Amendment Act, be reported to the Assembly as read for consideration in Committee of the Whole. Thank you.
Thank you. The motion is in order. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Bill 12, the Business Day Statute Law Amendment Act, will be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole. Thank you, Minister, and thank you to your officials. Members, we will take a very brief recess before proceeding to the next item on the agenda. Okay, I'm going to call the order, folks, order. I'm going to call the meeting back to order. We now turn to committee's ongoing statutory review of the NWT Heritage Fund Act. We are joined this morning by Mr. Kevin O'Reilly on behalf of Alternatives North. Mr. O'Reilly, please proceed with your presentation, and we'll then go to questions from committee members.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of Alternatives North. I did submit a PowerPoint presentation, so I'd like to work my way through the slides for about 20, 30 minutes and then leave some time for questions at the end, if that's all right. So the second slide gives an outline of what I'd like to try to cover today, a little bit of background on Alternatives North, the work that we've done on a Heritage Fund, and then look at how the Heritage Fund and legislation could be improved in our view. I'll draw a few conclusions and then make some recommendations for you. So on to the next slide, and I'm going to work through the background stuff fairly quickly, and I'll assume that you've all read it. So Alternatives North was founded in 1992. I was one of the founding members. We're set up as a registered nonprofit society in the Northwest Territories. We don't have any office or staff. It's a bunch of volunteers. I think last week you got a copy of a report that we've done on a guaranteed basic income as an example of the kind of work that we've done. Next page, please. I think we've have a pretty good track record in terms of working with other people and finding money and linking with experts in southern Canada as well. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done on a Heritage Fund in the past. During the Mackenzie Gas project, we were one of the interveners. We did receive some participant funding. With some of that participant funding, we hired the Pembina Institute out of Alberta to do work for us. And they did a report called A Review of Experience on Revenue from Non-Renewable Resources. And I just want to highlight some of the recommendations that were made back in 2006. The first set of recommendations they made were about revenue collection, and they recommended using cash bids early in a project in combination with taxes and royalties. That public governments should try to maximize the revenues from non-renewable resources. There should be efforts to capture windfall profits. Incentives, if necessary, should be temporary. Other taxes and fees can maximize revenues and avoid federal clawback. Should try to ensure high environmental performance, incorporate the polluter pays principle in the way that development is regulated. And of course, you need to be transparent and try to protect against boom and bust. And one of the ways you can do that is a Heritage Fund. Next slide, please. So the Pembina Institute, they did review a number of non-renewable permanent funds that are set up in other jurisdictions, including Alaska, Norway, Azerbaijan, East Timor, a few places. The lessons learned from that were to take a long-term approach to revenue accumulation, ensure clear accumulation and withdrawal rules on the fund itself, use future scenario modeling to help manage the revenues and the fund itself, and then make sure that you have a diversified investment portfolio. So that's the recommendations from the Pembina Institute back in 2006. In 2007, we made a recommendation to the Joint Review Panel on the Mackenzie Gas Project, and it's up there, you can read it on your own, but basically one of the recommendations we made was that there should be a non-renewable resource permanent fund set up to try to capture and invest some of the revenues from the Mackenzie Gas Project. Unfortunately, the government of the Northwest Territories disagreed with us, and you'll see their response below. But interestingly enough, about 2.5 years later, they did introduce a bill, and it was passed to set up a Heritage Fund. So next slide, please. So we made a written submission back in May of 2011 on the original bill itself. I want to just go over some of the recommendations that we made back in 2011. We felt that it was important to specify the source of the funds and that they should be set out in the legislation itself. And they could be something like an amount or percentage of the revenues, and they should be transferred on an annual basis into the fund. We felt that the fund should be operated in a way that would protect it from inflation. Next slide, please. And that there should be some protection from premature withdrawal of the capital. And we felt that there should be ways to ensure that the investments follow ethical and responsible investment standards. And lastly, that there should be an arm's length agency to manage the fund in the interest of all the people of the Northwest Territories. I can say I did review the committee report on this. Some of the recommendations we did make were actually accepted by the committee, and the committee pushed to increase the premature withdrawal provision from 10 to 20 years, and that's found in the current legislation. And there was an effort to actually incorporate a purpose into the bill, which was not present. So the committee did good work on this back in 2011 in reviewing the original legislation. So the next slide here deals with some of the issues that we raised with you back in September as you were embarking on your 10-year review. And I'm just going to run through some of these again for you. We felt that it would be important to look at the adequacy of resource revenues. Is the government of the Northwest Territories capturing a fair return for the resources that are extracted? Should a greater proportion of the resource revenues be invested into the fund? Should there be any ethical principles that govern how the fund should be invested? What, if any, expenditures can be made from the fund? Next slide, please. A few other points from our letter in September. We felt that there was a lack of transparency around public reporting, performance, and governance of the Heritage Fund. And an example of that might be that there's no defined contributions to the fund. It's basically a percentage of resource revenues. We felt that there should be some examination of other ways to limit cabinet discretion in that regard. And there's really a lack of public governance and accountability. And so next slide, I'm going to move into some of the sort of analysis that I did in preparation for the presentation. This is a very busy chart, and I don't expect you to read it, but the statistics here are from the Bureau of Stats, and what they are is the value of resources that are extracted and exported from the Northwest Territories. And they include columns for silver, gold, I can't even read it myself, other diamonds, oil and gas, and then there's a total, and then I should actually look at this chart because it's a little bit bigger. The total value of resource production, the royalties received are in another column, and that's taken straight from the public accounts. And the Heritage Fund balance is in the second last column, and where the Heritage Fund is specified a yield rate, I inserted that as well. So it's a very busy chart, but you can look at it at your leisure. But I took the liberty of extracting, I think, some of the highlights from this in the next slide, if we could. So since devolution on April 1st, 2014, over $20 billion worth of non-renewables resources have been extracted and exported from the Northwest Territories. So after 12 years, our Heritage Fund is now at about $50 million. And since devolution, $366 million have been paid to GNWT in royalties. The GNWT, though, only gets to keep $137 million or 0.68% of the value of the resources. There may be some other revenues coming to the government of the Northwest Territories, corporate taxes, personal income tax from workers and so on, but those are not disclosed in any way publicly. But in terms of the resource royalties, it doesn't look like there's a lot coming in from mining and oil and gas. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that highlights one of the studies that was done for industry, tourism, and investment back in 2017. This was by a consultant by the name of Andrew Bauer with the Natural Resource Governance Institute. He's based in Montreal. He said in looking at the mining fiscal regime that the Northwest Territories has one of the world's most charitable fiscal regimes for the mining sector. And then he goes on to provide some statistics. So I think that's advice from an independent expert. That study, though, is no longer seems to be available on the ITI website. Next slide, please. Yeah. So here's another expert that was actually hired by the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment in the last assembly. Don Hubert works for a consulting company called Resources for Development. They do very interesting work. They will not work for the private sector, but they will work for governments and indigenous governments in providing advice around the world on how to capture revenues from non-renewable resources and make sure it's invested and used wisely. So his observation on of the Northwest Territories was that it sells its non-renewable resources more cheaply than most other jurisdictions in the world. That's a direct quote from his report. And it is available on the, because the report was tabled in the House in September of 2021. The next slide, if I can, this is about the performance of the NWT Heritage Fund, and very small figures, but I'm sure your clerk can help print that out in a larger font if you ever need it. But I took these figures straight out of the annual financial statements of the Heritage Fund, and those are found in the public accounts, buried in section 3, I think, of the public accounts. And then I got some figures related to the Consumer Price Index for Canada and Yellowknife, and those came from the NWT Bureau of Stats. So on the next slide, I draw a few conclusions, I think, from that table for you. The net return on the Heritage Fund has fallen below CPI for Canada in 9 of 12 years of its existence. The NWT Heritage Fund is likely losing value against inflation. The Department of Finance consistently overestimates the value of the contribution to go into the Heritage Fund on an annual basis through annual budgeting. And if their original estimates were accurate or were actually guided the funds that went in, there'd be about $22 million more than the current balance if those estimates were correct. The Department of Finance, for a number of years, used a placeholder amount of $7.6 million to go into the Heritage Fund. I checked the budget, the main estimates that were tabled in the House last week for you, and the placeholder has gone down a little bit. I think it's now $6.1 million, but even that doesn't seem to be very accurate when you compare it to the year end for the current year. It's projected to be $482,000. So the Department of Finance seems to overestimate the amount of money going into the Heritage Fund on an annual basis. I would also observe that the contracted fees to manage the Heritage Fund have gone up by 71% over the last 5 years. Next slide, please. I want to move on to some observations about the transparency and accountability. And the rules for investing the Heritage Fund, those are set out in the regulations. And I'm not going to read this for you, but basically the money can only be put into government bonds, banks when they issue bonds, or and foreign-owned banks. There's a whole bunch, some rules around this. Municipal corporations as well. The fund can be invested in the bonds that they issue. Equities can only make up about 25% of the fund according to the regulations. You can see that they have to have pretty high credit ratings, and there's also some restrictions on the amount of how much of the assets can be invested into these various categories as well. All of that to say, the regulations set out how the money can be used. It's very, very risk averse, and doesn't seem to yield a very high return. But next slide, please. In terms of transparency and accountability, the only public reporting that's done on the Heritage Fund is through the public accounts, Section 3. No reports appear to have ever been tabled in the Legislative Assembly, even though it's required in the legislation. I couldn't find any, and it never happened in the 8 years I was in MLA. There's no reporting on the actual investments or performance, other than an occasional attempt to calculate the rate of return in the financial statements. There's no publicly available planning and accountability framework other than a general document that was prepared by the Department of Finance back in 2016. Accountability really comes through the annual budgeting process, and by practice, Cabinet has decided that 25% of GNWT's portion of resource revenues will go into the Heritage Fund. And as I said, that's done through the annual budget. So the Financial Management Board, which is essentially all the members of Cabinet, is the governing body. But since April of 2019, the management of the fund has been contracted out to CIBC Wood Gundy. Next slide, please. So here's some conclusions that we've drawn in terms of the Heritage Fund. We don't believe that we get a fair return for resources that are extracted from the Northwest Territories. Royalties have not changed in any significant way since devolution in 2014. We don't believe that the Heritage Fund is going to provide for intergenerational equity with a current rate of growth, and that's one of the purposes, or the purpose of the Heritage Fund, in fact. GNWT doesn't seem to do a very good job in predicting resource revenues and the Heritage Fund contributions, and that table, I think, illustrates that quite well. The value of the Heritage Fund doesn't seem to be keeping pace with the rate of inflation. Next slide, please. We don't believe there's very much in terms of transparency and accountability for the Heritage Fund beyond the annual budget and the public accounts. There's certainly, in our view, a need for greater transparency around the Heritage Fund, its performance and investment policies. There's no legislated criteria or requirements for contributions or withdrawal of funds. They could be put into the regulations, but the regulations are essentially silent on that. And there's really no clear role for public participation in oversight and management of the Heritage Fund. So a few recommendations now in the last couple of slides, or 3 slides to tie this up for you. So this slide is really aimed at trying to improve the position of the Heritage Fund over time. We believe that royalties and taxes on minerals and petroleum need to be increased to make sure that we capture a fair share of for the Northwest Territories residents. We believe that the contributions to the Heritage Fund should be increased to at least 50% of the retained resource revenues, and that amount should be set in legislation to reduce cabinet discretion, rather than do it on an annual basis through budgeting. We believe that GNWT needs to improve its ability to predict resource revenues, and that the performance of the Heritage Fund could be improved probably by loosening the investment policies. And that would require accepting more risk over the long term, but we also feel that the investments need to be guided by good ESG standards, that's environmental, social, and governance standards, and I'm sure you've heard of ESG before. That's widely used now in the investment and financing world as a way to try to encourage ethical and sustainable investments and financing. And we believe that there should be a long-term investment strategy developed for the Heritage Fund, and that it needs to be made public. Next slide. So some recommendations around transparency and accountability. We believe there should be some mandatory annual reporting, and that reporting should include an assessment of the performance of the fund, full disclosure of the actual investments that are actually made. I don't know if you actually know where the money is right now. There should be an annual public meeting on the fund and its performance. And the planning and accountability framework should be made public if there is one that exists. I noted in the annual, the financial statements, they're signed off by the secretary, essentially the secretary of the FMB, and they do mention that they have policies and in place, but I'm not sure if any of those have ever been disclosed publicly or even to yourselves. We also believe that there should be an independent expert panel established to provide some oversight on the fund, and that they can and should provide their observations and recommendations in each of the annual reports, and that government should respond to those right in the annual report, similar to what happens with audits that are carried out through the Office of the Auditor General. Next slide, please. A few more recommendations on transparency and accountability. We believe it's important to continue to do the 10-year reviews. This is the first review that's ever been done. It's a couple of years late, but I think we also believe that it would be important to make sure that there's an external component, or that the review itself is actually carried out externally, not just by a committee or MLAs. We believe that there should be some ESG screens on the way the money is invested. And we believe that there should be the 20-year freeze on the use of the public funds needs to be maintained to make sure that, and there should be, though, a way to develop the criteria for the use of those funds over time after the 20-year freeze comes off, and that you now have about 8 years to develop a process that would allow for some public input into the development of those withdrawal criteria. And that's it, Mr. Chair. I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you, and happy to try to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm now going to turn it over to committee members for questions. I have Mr. Hawkins up first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to say I appreciate Alternatives North's presentation. In particular, I want to say I really appreciate the work that Mr. Riley's put into this. And I'm often like to use occasions like this to say, you know, despite what he might think sometimes, I think we're politically closer on some issues, not all, than he probably believes we are. So I want to stress that. Because I think this is a good occasion to remind him that I see some things very similar, and we shouldn't be afraid to also see things differently. As far as, I won't go down memory lane too long, Mr. Chairman, what I would say is I remember, because I was there in the inception of the process, I remember fighting for 20 years, and it was fought one, barely, which is there was an interest at the time of much shorter times. It was for members, and including the public, it was to be in advance of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, thinking about the old proverbial count your chickens before they hatch situation. And in some ways, you needed this mechanism in place before it started. So whether it was perfect or not, you know, good was more than acceptable than perfect, because I didn't think we'd get to perfect, and hence we may have lost it all. So I remember the graphs of, you know, the millions that were being flooded into the north based on what was currently going on and what would future going on. And it's unfortunate, but the future didn't play out as predicted. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, and again, I said I wouldn't spend too much time going down memory lane with respect to where the funds get directed and whatnot. There was a lot of robust conversations, not strictly by myself, but many members included, to ensure this wasn't a slush fund for the finance minister at their will, without, you know, constantly, you know, the old cornerstone or keystone of what its success would be is about providing long-term benefit for all Northerners. And what that looked like, I'll tell you, I don't remember, but I frankly, like specifically saying it would be dedicated to, say, roads or healthcare education, but I do remember people saying we need it far enough down the road, it makes some money, don't steal from it, and don't play with it, let it invest, and then we'll address it. So maybe now is the time to put a reminder as in why it's there, as in the sense of the purpose or how we manage it. But I just want to highlight the recommendations. I think I agree with almost, I wouldn't say all of them, but I'd certainly say I agree with most of them. I would, bless you to the colleague who just sneezed. I think maybe my first question really would be is to start off with, I appreciate you highlighting ESGs as a comment. They are the current standard that weren't there before. We just did that. People did that because they felt good. Now it's like an open standard that most people are subscribing to. Hopefully the Trump regime will kill that principle or interest in those areas. But what does the presenter mean by loosen investment policies? We'll start with that because I'm curious what that means. Thank you. From his point of view.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks. Well, loosen investment policies, the way that the Heritage Fund can be used is set out in the regulations. And look, I'm not a finance guy, I'm not a lawyer, but I had the one slide there that indicates that the kinds of investments that can be made are very risk averse. It's basically bonds that are issued by governments, banks, municipal corporations that have very high credit ratings, and only 25% of the fund can be put into equities, and there's some rules kind of around that as well. So look, I get that people want to make sure that the money is not put at risk, but I think the regulations and ways of investing are so strict that the rate of return is not yielding even what CPI is, or inflation. So the value of the fund is losing. The value of the fund it's losing against inflation over time, and I think that needs to be corrected to at least maintain the principle. So I think that needs to be one of the investment policies, or what drives this is that you want to at least keep pace with inflation, maybe even make a little bit of money on this. So loosening it, well, look, I'm not a finance guy, but get yourself some expert opinion that can give you some advice on how to reduce the restrictiveness of the regulations to allow for you to at least keep pace with inflation. Get some advice on that. I'm not the guy to provide it, but I think we need to at least maintain the value of the fund. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Yeah, and committee had a presentation 2 presenters ago about the fund where they were highlighting the performance of the Australia and New Zealand's funds, are both kind of the gold standards that are being referred to these days, that are hitting 10% a year of return. So certainly committee does have some evidence on the record about how things can be done better. Mr. Hawkins, a second question?
Thank you. I was going to comment on that, but I think that's good information as a reminder. I just want to say one thing that, just to wrap up, more of a comment, Mr. Chairman, unless the presenter wants to comment back, that is, eventually there may become a time, and I'm referring to short term, not 10 years from now, we may want to start reflecting as the why do we have a fund, and I'm referring to the savings or the investment portfolio question, and that really speaks to the question that keeps coming up, which is if we're not making enough money. Now, I wholeheartedly believe in the Heritage Fund, and I believe in the principle of why we created it, but we have to find a way to make, for it to make money. So governments are inherently risk adverse. We all know that. It's all run by lawyers and accountants behind the scenes, and if you're involved in consensus government, you also know it's also run by the bureaucracy. So, the political leadership on this is really tough in the sense of seeing where it is. I guess the question is, what would be a reasonable, strong return, even to ask the question, why do we maintain the fund? Like, are we maintaining the fund just to be good people and say we're investing in the future? But as the presenters pointed out, if we're losing more than CPI, we're actually losing money, and maybe the money should go into schools, healthcare, et cetera. So, I mean, the dynamics of, do we borrow money and spend more money on that money to solve today's problems? Do we invest this money into today for tomorrow? But again, we're losing money in the sense of value of it. So I know our presenter, I don't know extremely well, but I know him well, and he's right. He's not an accountant. Either am I. I'm not an investor. So, I mean, it's a dynamic challenge. Has the Alternatives North thought about, or is this the best way to manage or to deal with resource revenue? Question ultimately is, would you have a different recommendation? In other words, collapse the fund if it's not making a certain amount of money, or redirect it in a different form? Thank you.
Thanks. Over to the presenter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, we were one of the organizations that really pushed for a Heritage Fund in the first place. And I think this goes back to the way that we and others tend to think about resources, particularly non-renewable resources like diamonds or oil and gas. These are one-time natural wealth that once it's extracted, it's gone forever. And if you believe in intergenerational equity, or a way of making sure that we benefit from those resources, and not just this generation, but future generations, we've got to find a way to try to spread that wealth out. And that's why we hired the Pembina Institute back in 2006 to look at the whole issue of what governments do with resource revenues. And one of the ways to try to provide for intergenerational equity is through a sovereign wealth fund, heritage fund, non-renewable resource permanent fund. They're all the similar names for the same sort of concept of setting aside money so that those that come after you are still going to benefit from it. I guess our government made a conscious decision that with devolution coming, being anticipated, and it did happen in 2014, that our government wanted to do this, similar to a lot of other governments around the world. But they also made a decision that only 25% of the resource revenues retained by GNWT will go into the fund. That means the other 75% are used for, and if you read the documentation at the time, are for debt management and investment into infrastructure. So has that really provided intergenerational equity? Well, I think that's a good question for you folks to pose and ponder as well. But I guess our position is that we still believe that there can and should be a heritage fund. You know, I mentioned how $20 billion worth of resources have left the Northwest Territories since devolution. That's a lot of wealth that's leaving here, and you know, I think people need to ask, are we getting a fair share of that as well? So yeah, we still believe in a heritage fund as a tool to provide that intergenerational equity. How to make sure that you can improve the rate of return? Well, one of the recommendations is look at other investment policies, make them public, providing external oversight and more accountability on the use of the funds and the performance of the funds. I don't know whether any of you, when I was here for 8 years, I didn't really spend a lot of time looking at the Heritage Fund, even in the public accounts. I think one of the recommendations from a group that looked at this, was a bunch of students actually, was that one of the standing committees should carry out a public review of the Heritage Fund Act annual reports. Not just the financial statements, but look at the performance on an annual basis. I think there needs to be better communications and awareness in the public as well about the Heritage Fund. We don't really promote it and talk about it a lot. And when it's buried in the public accounts in Section 3 and nobody really talks about it, nobody's really aware of it as well. So lots of, I think, work that can and should be done to raise the public awareness, improve management of the fund, performance of the fund, more accountability, transparency, and I think some of the recommendations we've made should help with that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I have Mr. Rogers up next for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly, for the presentation. And I certainly agree around the management transparency. I think we've had those conversations at this committee moving forward and how we want to look at that. And I've stated here, certainly I think our 25% in equities is too low. I think we are too risk adverse, so I'm happy to hear that in the presentation. I agree, if you have to take a little risk if you want to make some money. I'm just wondering, and I know you mentioned that you're certainly not a lawyer or a finance guy, but in your research, I guess, and some of the experts that you've certainly quoted here in your presentation, have you kind of looked at how, I guess, Alternatives North would see a good kind of investment strategy or a better makeup? Have that been any recommendations that you received, I guess, from your research on that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, I'll confess this is not an area I know anything about, but in the little bit of work that I've looked at, you want to avoid something called the Dutch disease, where you invest too much in your own economy. I think Norway has the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. It's over $1 trillion. They've done an excellent job at managing their oil, as a resource, a public resource, but they did it through a couple of different mechanisms. They had state ownership, which doesn't happen in Canada often enough, in my humble opinion. But that's we can have that discussion outside of the room at some point. But they also had very strict rules around the investment of the funds and the retention of those funds. And so I think there's a lot of really good lessons to be learned from that. Beyond that, I'm not a finance guy, and I think you're best to look to some other folks to give you better advice. But when it's not meeting CPI over time, there's a problem there. And I think they tried to, I want to give the Department of Finance some credit. It was, managed off the side of somebody's desk once in a while. Then they contracted it out to CIBC Wood Gundy. Maybe the rate of return has improved, but then now you got management fees to worry about. So there's trade-offs there, but surely we can and should be doing better. But I'm not the guy to give you that advice, sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate this. And get into bonds versus equities versus T-bills. Of course, that's a conversation to have with whomever we decide manages this fund and moves it forward. Just a quick question around ethical investments, and this is always a tough one, because if you look at, for example, tobacco stocks are widely prized by a lot of investors because of their dividend yield, and their, but is that, does that get canceled out on ethical investment or others? So I guess it kind of depends who you're speaking to or which group you're speaking to on ethical investments. I don't know if you have anything further on that, or if if Alternatives North dove into that a little more and kind of picked out what they would consider ethical investments versus non-ethical investments. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this in our submission back in 2011. Suggested that I think there was some thinking about, maybe not investing in tobacco, arms manufacture, things like that. And I did see in some of the work that was done by the Pembina Institute that the Norway Permanent Fund, pension fund, decided to take its money out of Barrick Gold because of its environmental and human rights track record, a Canadian mining company. They decided to divest of Walmart as well because of their labor track record. So, and I know that a portion of their permanent fund has stricter ethical investment rules and environmental considerations than most of the funds, so that they've kind of portioned off a portion of their fund and use it for trying to promote greater sustainability. Our fund is still pretty small, but I do think if we're going to start to put more emphasis on equities, then I think you want to make sure you need to at least be transparent, and that means disclosing if there are any rules around it. And if you don't have any, be honest and just say that. But I don't know what the rules are around the investment in the equities. I don't know what the money's into. We don't know how much is in different kinds of bonds with different governments, banks. We don't know how much is in equities and what equities. Don't know, because it's not transparent. That's not a good place to be. So whatever the policies are, make sure they're transparent and provide greater accountability. And then if people want to change them, at least know what they are. We don't even know what they are right now, and that's a problem. Thanks.
Thank you. I have Mr. Testart next for round one.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to speak as a non-member of the committee. Mr. O'Reilly and I think we see eye to eye on the Heritage Fund. We worked on this in a previous assembly. We probably differ on the finer points of the mining regime, as we need to maintain a competitive advantage in the north to offset our weaknesses in infrastructure, power, other things. So favorable taxes is one way we do that, and also the regime currently doesn't collect every economic benefit we get from the mining industry. Putting that aside, how we manage the Heritage Fund is the topic of the day, and it's not being managed well. I agree that transparency is critical and very absent here. I'm curious if you can speak to why, through your efforts to see it tabled in the House, as the legislation requires, why that was not done, and if you or Alternatives North received any, have heard from the Department of Finance on why they don't table the annual reports. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll turn it over to Mr. O'Reilly. I'm not sure if you saw, Mr. O'Reilly, when we did have the finance minister in front of committee a few months ago, her answer in part to this question was it's reported through the public accounts, and that is the public reporting. So that was her response at the time, just to give you some context. Thanks. And over to Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, no, thanks. I guess to be fair, I don't think I really pursued this as much as I should have when I was a regular MLA, but digging around, looking at the legislation again, it is supposed to be consistent with the Financial Administration Act that placed some additional restrictions on it. There is a planning and accountability framework that was developed in 2016 in conjunction with the Financial Administration Act, and the annual report section of that planning and accountability framework. I'm just going to read a couple of things in here, because this is the rules they're supposed to be following. So the annual report is, quote, this comprehensive report contains analysis of the activities conducted throughout the year, both financial and non-financial. In accordance with the FAA, the annual reports are tabled in the Legislative Assembly. The content of the annual reports, quote, must, quote, include management discussion and analysis providing an overview of the previous year's operations and how the year will influence decisions in the future. Those are quotes. That's not me making this up. This is from the Planning and Accountability Framework. Well, when I looked at the annual report such that it is, it's basically a set of financial statements. There's a management statement at the front of the annual reports. It's cookie cutter because it appears year after year. It's signed off by the in this case, the latest one by the Deputy Secretary Financial Management Board. It just basically says the statements have been prepared in accordance with Canadian public sector accounting standards. The Heritage Fund's reporting systems are achieved through the use of formal policies and procedures, careful selection of employees, blah, blah, blah. There's nothing in here about performance. There's nothing in here about how the year's activities are going to influence the way the fund is managed in the following year. There's nothing in here about that. So I don't believe it complies or it's consistent with the requirements in the legislation itself. As to why the there's no more annual reports other than what appears in the public accounts. You know, it took me a couple of hours of my own work to try to find the financial statements and then take them out of the public accounts and create my own little folder for them. And then one of the earliest report, I had to go to your great library downstairs to actually get that because it's not available on a website anywhere. So that's not very good accountability or transparency, and I don't think it's meeting the minimum requirements of the legislation. So I would encourage you guys are reviewing the budget now. Ask lots of questions about this on the floor. But where's the annual report? Where's the public information about performance? You got an opportunity to do it right now on the floor. So I don't, yeah. That's my little rant about how it's not even consistent, I think, with the current legislation, the accountability and transparency of it. So, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Tessar, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. I think we might take a look at that at the public accounts review, which is ongoing as well, and maybe we can improve accountability there. Because of course, if we're not compliant with our own rules, it's up to us to follow those rules, and there's no one else who's going to tell us to do that. Moving on to like investment criteria, I guess I have a two-part question. Just noting the time. One is, do you think if we were ever to does Alternatives North have a position on if the fund was performing well, let's say, and was a significant amount, pulling interest out of that fund and using it to fund infrastructure and whatever the NWT wants, but contributing to the general revenue stream? And then question two, would you take or do you have a position on whether the fund's criteria was loosened up and some of the fund was used to invest in resource development projects in the Northwest Territories? Because that's one thing we are hearing from the resource sector, is that there is not a lot of equity in markets to sustain resource development in the Northwest Territories. And of course, this fund will cease to have a purpose if there's no royalties flowing into it. So one way we could change that, there used to be a rule in Canadian the big Canadian funds that they had to invest, 90% of them had to go back into Canada. When that was the environment, it was easier for companies to go to market and get funding for their projects. We don't have that rule anymore. The feds took it out. But we have the ability to put our own rules in for the Northwest Territories. So is that those kind of two prongs, interest and whether or not it would be appropriate to invest in future resource projects with the Heritage Fund? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly,
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll do my best. On the use of the funds, we really haven't talked a lot about that. But in our presentation, we did make a recommendation that if the 20-year freeze is maintained for any withdrawals from the fund, that you've got 8 years now to actually develop those rules. And whether the committee wants to dive into some of those considerations now, that's up to you folks, of course, to decide. But we feel there's at least enough time to develop some withdrawal rules now. Got 8 years to do it, whether you do it all now or what we had proposed is to at least start to set up a public process to develop those rules now. So I think that's an important thing to do. There are some rules in the legislation now around the withdrawals, and I can't find the act in my pile of paper, but it's, you can't withdraw any of the principal. You can only withdraw up to, I think, 5% of the interest that's been earned in any one given year. Beyond that, if you want to make withdrawals, it requires a special act to be brought forward by the proposed withdrawal by the Financial Management Board has to be brought forward in a bill by the Finance Minister. The Standing Committee, though, in its initial reviews, did recommend that there needed to be a supermajority passage of that bill. Well, congratulations on that. Unfortunately, the minister wouldn't accept that potential amendment, but it is within your purview as part of this review to consider that. We haven't taken a position on that personally. I think it's a good idea. You want to make sure everybody's on side if you're going to start using the nest egg that's been set aside for future generations. Anyways, all that to say, I think you've got some time. Look at this carefully, study how other jurisdictions have done this, but make sure there's a public process in place to develop those rules. As to whether you want to use some of the funds on resource development projects, I think a couple of considerations there. One is, I mentioned earlier, the Dutch disease, where you don't want to spend or invest too much money in your own jurisdiction because it can actually fuel inflation and put a whole series of other pressures on public financing. So that's something to be aware of and be careful of. Whether incentives or investments in resource development is a good idea or not, I think that's something you should leave to the public process. I don't think Alternatives North is opposed to government ownership, equity, stake in resource development on the part of the government. In fact, I think we've actually proposed that a few other times. But I think that's an issue that really needs to be examined carefully in the development of those withdrawal rules. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Rita, have you, last but not least, for first round?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. O'Reilly, for coming in today. Just briefly, you mentioned earlier, and we're all aware that when resource royalties come into the GNWT, 25 is slotted for the Heritage Fund, 75 is usually for debt servicing and for infrastructure. And in your presentation, you've noted that Alternatives North is interested in seeing the Heritage Fund be increased to 50%. Can you speak to as why Alternatives North has selected that percentage? What work you did to accomplish sort of that recommendation? Thank you.
Thanks. Over to the presenter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Look, it wasn't a lot of work. That was a figure I picked out of the air. So we just think 25% is not going to build intergenerational equity. The current rate of accumulation after 12 years, we're only at $50 million. I know that you heard from the Department of Finance, and they say in the next 5 years it might go up to 75 million. But boy, their estimates are so far off. I'm not sure that. I don't know what that's based on, but I do think we need to have greater ability within, I guess, ITI and finance to actually predict what resource revenues are. But what the actual figure should be, I think that's something you folks can and should study and look at how the best practices in other sovereign wealth funds. But to be honest, that was just a figure that I picked out of the air. So I think it needs to be increased from 25. What is the appropriate level? Well, you're going to hear from other folks, I hope, on that issue as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you have a follow-up, Ms. Reid? Do I have any further questions for round one from members? Yeah, I saw you on round two. Seeing none, I'll go to round two. Mr. Hawkins, I have you up first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think just quickly here, I just wanted to provide some closing thoughts because I know we're reaching the end of our presentation. Everyone's time is very valuable, including Mr. O'Reilly's. And we still have much more work to be done. But it's funny, it came up in conversation here, the supermajority. I fought like heck to get that because I often believe that very, very deep important decisions can't win out the day by one vote because they create frustration and resentment. And when we're talking about the Heritage Fund as such, it's hard to revisit this a year later after the money's gone. So, losing a vote by one and all of a sudden the gates are open, you can say we didn't like the way something was voted on. You can revisit those, but you can't revisit money that's left. Just quickly, my comments, I'll just say in a kind of a bullet form. I believe all resources should, money that's available should be going into it. Is 100% of our pot of the money right? I think in some ways I believed it was. But I also recognize at the time of, as we reflect back, I also recognize at the time one of the big issues I was worried about was debt too. So do we allow debt to continue to control, proceed in the manner, I don't want to say out of control, but proceed in the manner it is. So I think that's a good question to struggle with. The unaccountability of the resource revenue once it hits the general revenues is frustrating, I mean, to me. So could we lock it in for another 20 years? I don't think it's a bad question. Could we lock it in for a longer period of time? I honestly don't think we need to develop the criteria today. The reason I say is if we proceed to locking it in further or push it out further, I'd be worried about the I don't remember what the analogy's called, but when you have a decision so far away, it becomes meaningless and you avoid it and you don't make an effective one, and you don't want to leave it too late because then you're making a rush one. So what is the right time? And I almost wonder if the next assembly or thereafter the following assembly is at a better position to make a decision on the principles of the day then, as opposed to this one. But I don't disagree with the principles of thinking about it either, and I would also stress we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. And I certainly would say that I agree that we should probably look at some more, we'll call it performing funds. And maybe the last thing, Mr. Chairman, is I do remember, I can't attribute this to myself in any way, so I don't want to pretend I'm taking credit for this, but I do remember the discussion about having external talent fully overseeing and managing the fund at the fruition of this. But for some reason, there's something in the back of my mind saying at the time that there was no money in there to manage. So at the time, it may have been more a sense of a practicality, I seem to recall. So why hire people in oversight and set up this enormous infrastructure if there's not a lot of money? But I think the question really is, okay, how much? Where's the tipping point of saying now there's real investment dollars? Now, you know, we expect a bigger return. I mean, $1 million is a lot of money to me. Let's not kid ourselves. And I know a lot of people that would be like a flood of money. But for governments and organizations, that's not a lot of money. And you lose a lot of money in the fees and interest and whatnot. So perhaps now's the time, as recommended by Alternatives North, to have that type of oversight, transparency and whatnot. And oh, sorry, one last comment of observation is that, although not a problem for today, but I certainly think within the scope of today, we all know of the debt clock, or we should have almost like a heritage clock, and let people know what their public heritage looks like, on a link on the finance website, so then they know, are their resources going? And maybe even on that webpage, I could say the principles of the Heritage Fund is opening up for discussion and things of those general bullet nature. It doesn't have to be I'm describing it as a 20-page web page. It could literally be just a simple open up and see the principles of the Heritage Fund, when it's coming up due, how much it's making, things like that. And at least the public trust it on the minimum of transparency. You can see it either growing fast, growing slow, at least where it is. And people know where the future intergenerational nest egg is sitting at. And I'd like that maybe for a future conversation. It doesn't have to be resolved today. But anyway, just general comments as we're wrapping up, Mr. Chairman, and I wanted to put them on the record. And again, I want to thank Mr. O'Reilly for his thoughtful observations. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't hear a question there, but Mr. O'Reilly, do you want to respond in any way? There's no obligation.
Yeah, no, and I recognize your time is short, but I just want to turn to the issue of oversight. There was this group of students that looked at, they did report a question of future prosperity, developing a heritage fund in the Northwest Territories. It was tabled in the House back in February of 2014, and one of the students that was looking at this was actually from Fort Smith, and they recommended Heritage Fund Supervisory Council, which is, an interesting idea. They said that it should act as trustee for the funds, representatives from NWT Financial Management Board, independent financial experts, and civil society. And that's kind of what we're suggesting as well. It doesn't have to be a massive amount of money or something, and it can be done through a public process of people expressing, their interest in serving on something like this, and they have meet once or twice a year, work with, or quarterly, look at the statements, ask questions, make recommendations, and then Department of Finance, the minister has to respond to those observations, recommendations right in the annual report. So anyways, I think we're at a stage where that is necessary. It's no longer good enough to just have the FMB managing this without any oversight other than through the financial statements that go into Schedule 3 of the public accounts. Anyways, we've made some recommendations around the issue of transparency, oversight, and building some accountability, and now's the time to do that, where, after 12 years, we need to do a lot better. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Hawkins, did you have a follow-up question, or I get the impression you got your thoughts out? Nope.
No, it's just the same.
Okay.
I agree that maybe there's a different way of doing it, and there are a lot of ways of achieving the same result. So perhaps that's a great avenue. And earlier, my comments were just overall observations. And again, I thank the presenter for their time. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Mr. Testard, I have you up for round 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, are you familiar with the other managed heritage funds in Canada, or funds like them in Canada, and the transparency provisions around them? Because I'm interested in like the your suggestion or recommendation around like annual general meetings, kind of to like discuss the fund and more of a public process. I know Alberta has a very large, well, formerly a very large heritage fund. It's been significantly diminished to pay for other things, but how are the transparency provisions in these other funds compared to ours? Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I confess I haven't really spent a lot of time looking at that, but I did, in the Pembina report, it did say that the Alberta Heritage Fund, such that it is, it was capped for a good number of years, so there wasn't money going into it, but at one point at least it was managed by a standing committee of MLAs. All parties were represented. They were the ones that were providing direction and so on. There was public meetings held about its management and performance across Alberta. It was a subject of some pretty hot discussion and conversations, as I understand. So, I'm not sure we need to go to that extent, but there needs to be a role for the public in at least better understanding what the Heritage Fund is and its performance and what's happening with it. And having financial statements buried in Section 3 of the public accounts is not going to do it. You cannot find these easily on the Department of Finance website. There's nothing about a Heritage Fund easily found on the Department of Finance website. There needs to be a standalone web page where this stuff is made publicly available. And in our presentation, we recommended an annual public meeting as a way to do that. That can be done virtually, I think it's beyond the point where we need to create greater accountability and transparency. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testard.
Thank you. Such as it is, the government's taken a position to disclose the performance of the fund in the public accounts. We do have public accounts hearings. Do you think those are sufficient? Obviously, we didn't. This latest one, there wasn't as much focus on it. But let's say we have another hearing specifically about the Heritage Fund, or that specifically references it, provides questions around it, and responses from the Comptroller General. Would that satisfy some of Alternatives North's concerns around that need for like an annual meeting? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm going to answer that maybe a couple of different ways. First off, I want to turn to there's a group, and I'm sure you know this, the International Forum for Sovereign Wealth Funds, and I did look at the Santiago Principles that are outlined in their 2008 document, and I just kind of started to do a little mental check against what I think, or at least what I know of our practices and policies around this, and I don't think we pass a lot of these principles. We're just not consistent with them, particularly around transparency, accountability, disclosure. And, I mentioned having the financial statements buried in Section 3. The annual reporting that is done is basically financial statements. And you know that there is one figure, I think, in there somewhere around the rate of return, but not really a lot of detail. We should be disclosing what the money is put into. And if it takes a page of bulleted lists of what those bonds are, how much is held in them, what the equities are, that should be publicly disclosed. We need to know what the money's actually put into. We need to know more about the performance of the fund. We need to know what the written investment policies are. The Secretary says that they do have formal policies and procedures. What are those? Have you ever seen them? I've never seen them. The Santiago Principles say that stuff should be made public as part of best practices. So we're not consistent with internationally set standard practices around the sovereign wealth funds. So I would encourage you as MLAs and public accounts in particular to dive into this and ask lots of questions around it. And I think you also have the ability to propose amendments to the legislation, and I encourage you to do that. Think carefully about it, get some help from your law clerk, and propose changes to the legislation to require greater disclosure, transparency, and accountability. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Do I have any further questions from committee on this matter at this time? For round two. I do have a couple of my own to ask. We are running pretty short on time here, but one thing I wanted to poke on a little bit was, you mentioned in your presentation dissatisfaction with the royalty regime in the NWT, the amount of economic rent that we're successfully pulling from industry. And I would just note, in this budget, the royalties have dried to a complete trickle this year, which is pretty concerning. And of course, the big producing mines are starting to wind down, and haven't seen indication that a new one is looking to open just yet. I mean, there's definitely some projects potentially on the horizon, but nothing set in stone just yet. No pun intended. But I guess to get to the question, I mean, I know that there was quite a bit of work done by the previous assembly on royalties. The government released a couple different discussion papers. Committee held briefings of their own. None of it seemed to result in significant change to the royalty regime. I'm wondering if you, considering your experience as a previous member, have any advice for committee on how we might actually make some headway on this, or if you think it's even possible to make headway, considering the various different perspectives that were collected when we last reviewed royalties, which was quite recently. Thanks.
Yeah, that'll really get me going, but no, thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. As I understand it, the department is working on regulations to help implement the Mineral Resources Act. The Mineral Resources Act was passed 6 years ago, and as I understand, there's going to be 2 phases of regulations. The first phase, not even going to deal with royalties, as I understand it. I think it's going to be in the second phase, but I'm yet to see a real plan for and a schedule for how the Mineral Resources Act is going to be implemented. I've seen a few attempts at that. There might have been something in the discussion paper, though, I think policy intentions paper or something that was released in August of 2023. It's time to get that updated. Like, I don't know what the schedule is anymore and when and where royalties are going to be dealt with. Oil and gas, probably not going to happen very quickly, and there's not a lot going on in that sector right now. But on the mining front, I think you want to have that sorted out. As I understand it, there seemed to be some appetite for a minimum royalty on mining to make sure that there would be something captured, even in the early life of a mine, and then to do some kind of hybrid model that would allow for different kinds of things to be written off, including costs related to consultation with Indigenous governments and things like that. I think some of those principles or thoughts have been captured, but at the end of the day, where's the beef, so to speak? There's nothing in writing, and given that is or has been a potentially large revenue stream, I would urge you to continue to push on that and find out the status of the work and what's being done on it. And because 6 years, 10 years after devolution, there have been no significant changes. Why did we get devolution in the first place if it wasn't to do things better and differently than the federal government? I fully support working with Indigenous governments, and that's a legal requirement now. It's not optional. It's the way that the Northwest Territories works now. But 10 years, we haven't changed the royalty regime in any significant way. That's not good. And I think a demonstration of that is performance and the amount of money going into the Heritage Fund. And look at how much the value of the resources that are flowing out of here. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And the last one I wanted to ask about is just one of the recommendations you made. Similar to other committee members, I think a lot of the recommendations I generally agree with and appreciate, and they line up with some of the recommendations we were getting from experts on sovereign wealth funds as well. The one that you made was continue the 10-year reviews, but make them external, so get them out of committee. Can you explain what you mean by that a bit more? Just want to hear from you what you think of the external reviews and what you think, what you mean by that, really.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, when we wrote to you back in September of last year, it wasn't even clear to us who was carrying out the review. I had anticipated or thought that there'd be a motion in the House to delegate the authority for the review to a standing committee. I don't think that happened. At least I'm not aware of it. So it wasn't clear whether, and I watched the presentation from the Department of Finance back in August, I believe, of last year, and they were kind of a little hesitant, taking a bit of a hands-off, like, we're going to give you information, but we don't want to really do this kind of stuff ourselves. But it wasn't clear to us who was actually going to carry out the review. So but I appreciate that the committee has taken this on. You've developed a report with the key questions you're going to ask. You've got a bit of a timetable, how you're going to go about that. I think that's really helpful for the public to see that you actually have a way of approaching this, and that's good. But at some point, maybe when the fund is bigger, 10 years from now, when the next review is done, I'm not sure having MLAs do it is always a great idea. Maybe it should be an outside body, an outside group that has some expertise with this that carries out the review of the Heritage Fund and makes recommendations to a standing committee. So at least I think that's what we're suggesting, is that there needs to be more work done outside of the standing committee on this, and maybe that can and should be done externally, especially as the fund starts to grow over time. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And I certainly hope it does start to grow. I hope committee is able to make some recommendations that can maybe contribute to that happening. With that said, do any committee members have final questions for the presenter before I close the public portion of the meeting? I'm seeing no hands up. So I'm going to say thank you to Mr. O'Reilly and to Alternatives North for taking the time to come and share all this information with committee. It was certainly helpful for me, and appreciate getting some recommendations from the public, and particularly from NWT residents about their thoughts on what to do with the Heritage Fund in this 10-year review. Mr. O'Reilly, if you want to make any closing comments, you can.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I will confess that I neglected to see a couple of your meetings where you did invite some experts in, and so I will watch that. And I would encourage you to continue to get views from outside, but I would encourage you to also hire your own independent technical expertise to help you interpret what folks are saying, and look elsewhere as well. So I would encourage you to retain your own technical expertise as part of this review. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. So that concludes this presentation, and it concludes the public portion of this meeting. So we will take a second to close off the broadcast. If committee members can stick around, we just have a bit of ministerial correspondence to look at, and so we'll quickly move to that as soon as Mr. O'Reilly gathers up his papers and clears out. Thank you, and thank you to the public if there was anyone observing.